Okay, so, sometimes you come across a book and you're just like, wow, how is this thing still relevant today?
Right.
And that's how I feel about this one, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Like, it's been around for almost a
It's
century.
incredible, right?
People are still finding it, reading it, recommending it.
Yeah, you don't get that kind of staying power without tapping into something truly universal about, human nature.
Yes. And it's fascinating because, there was reading what Dale Carnegie's daughter, Donna Dale Carnegie, had to say in the updated edition. Like, these ideas, they weren't exactly, brand new, right?
Yeah.
It was more about the way he put them together.
It's the packaging. He made it stick.
Yeah. He made it sick. It's like a guidebook almost for like how to just have better relationships, which, who doesn't want that, right?
It's timeless.
Yeah.
And you know what I found fascinating? The fact that, engineers were some of the first people to really flock to his courses.
Like engineers. Really? You'd think.
You'd think, right?
Yeah.
You think of engineers as, the left-brained, logical people.
His systems.
And yet they were drawn to this.
To these ideas about, people skills.
Because they realize that's the other half of the equation.
Yeah.
Right. You can have all the technical brilliance in the world.
You can build the most amazing bridge, but if you can't
communicate, if you can't lead a team, if you can't get buy-in for your ideas,
right,
it's not going anywhere. And that's as true today as it was then.
Absolutely. Like that saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. But even more than that, right?
Yeah.
It's about how you make people feel.
100%. And one of the principles that he really hits hard in the book, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but don't criticize, condemn, or complain.
Oh, easier said than done.
Way easier said than done.
Yeah.
But he understood that, criticism, more often than not, puts people on the defensive.
Right.
And when they're on the defensive, they're not listening.
They're building walls.
They're building walls.
Yeah.
Exactly. He uses the example of Al Capone. Al Capone, notorious gangster.
Right.
Would not admit wrongdoing.
Even Capone?
Even Capone.
Yeah.
And if Al Capone, with everything he'd done, is still trying to protect his ego, it's something fundamental about human nature.
Right. So what's the alternative? Like, how do you approach these situations where you do need to give feedback or address an issue without triggering that defensiveness? Because I think we've all been in those situations where, someone's coming at you with criticism and you immediately put your guard up.
Totally. You're not open to hearing it, even if it's valid, right?
Right.
So Carnegie, he suggests, starting with appreciation, finding common ground, focusing on what you can agree on. Because it's like greasing the wheels a little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like you're saying, hey, I see you, I hear you,
Yeah.
before you kind of dive into the, okay, but maybe we could do this a little differently.
Exactly. And it's not about being fake or manipulative.
Right. It's got to be genuine.
It has to be genuine. Carnegie really believed in the power of sincerity. And that leads us to another one of his principles, which is becoming genuinely interested in others, right?
Because that's something that shines through, right? Like you can tell when someone's really interested in what you have to say.
Totally. And it's not always easy, right? It
Right.
takes effort to kind of quiet your own inner monologue and really focus on the other person.
Right. To be present in that moment.
But when you do it, it makes such a difference. And he gives all these little tips and tricks in the book, like remember people's names.
Oh, yeah. That's huge. Because I'll admit, I'm terrible with names.
But it's so simple. But think about it. When someone remembers your name, especially if you've only met them once or twice, it just makes you feel good.
It does. It makes you feel seen, right? Like you matter.
Exactly. And that's what Carnegie was getting at, that little things like that can go such a long way in building relationships. Like he talks about Jim Farley, right, who was the postmaster general
You're right.
under FDR. And he knew everybody's name,
Well,
not just their name. He knew their family members, their birthdays, their interests.
that's impressive.
And it wasn't just a parlor trick for him. It was because he was genuinely interested in people. He made it a point to remember those details because he valued those connections.
And it obviously served him well, right? I mean, the guy was postmaster general.
Right. He built the network that way.
Mm.
And that's something that I think is so relevant today, especially in the age of social media.
Right, where it's so easy to kind of just scroll and not really connect with anyone.
Exactly. It's like we're more connected than ever, but also more disconnected in a way.
Right. So how do we bring it back to that genuine connection?
Well, I think Carnegie had some good ideas about that.
Mhm.
He talks about the importance of asking questions, really listening to the answers.
Being present in the conversation.
Exactly. And also not being afraid to talk about yourself, but doing it in a way that's engaging and relatable. He tells this great story about Howard Thurston, this famous magician. And before he would go on stage, he would tell himself, love my audience, love my audience.
Love my audience.
Because it's so easy when you're performing or even just in a conversation to get caught up in your own head. Right?
Oh, yeah. You're thinking, am I being interesting? Am I making a good impression?
Totally. But when you shift that focus to how can I make this person feel good? How can I make them feel heard? It changes the whole dynamic.
That's a great point. It's not about you, it's about them. And I think that's something that we often forget, especially in like professional settings where it can feel like it's all about, promoting yourself or getting ahead.
Totally. And Carnegie, he actually has a whole chapter in the book called How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. And one of the key points he makes is the importance of avoiding arguments.
Oh, that's a tough one. Because sometimes I feel like you just got to get your point across,
I know. But he says, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Like, you can't argue someone into agreeing with you.
Right, because then they're just going to dig their heels in even more.
Exactly. So instead, he suggests, like, finding common ground, showing respect for the other person's opinion, even if you don't agree with it. And that ties back to his whole philosophy of, like, really trying to see things from the other person's perspective.
Because we all have our own experiences that shape how we see the world.
Exactly. And he tells this great story about this tax inspector. And this consultant, he's trying to convince this tax inspector of something. And tax inspector is just, like, not having it.
Not budging.
Not budging at all. So finally, the consultant, he just kind of shifts gears, and he starts asking the tax inspector about his work. Like, tell me about what you do. Tell me about the challenges you face.
Oh, interesting. So he kind of put the focus on the other person.
Exactly. And by doing that, he created this connection with the tax inspector. He made him feel heard and respected. And guess what? By the end of the conversation, the tax inspector was totally on board with his ideas.
Wow. So it's like that saying, you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar.
Totally. It's about finding those points of connection, those things that you can agree on, and building from there. Because when people feel understood and respected, they're much more likely to be open to what you have to say.
It's amazing how, a simple shift in approach can make such a big difference.
It really is. And Carnegie, he talks about this idea of, appealing to people's nobler motives.
Nobler motives. Okay.
So it's like, instead of assuming the worst in people, assume the best. Assume that they want to do the right thing. And he tells a story about this customer who was ready to burn the company to the ground, right?
Yeah.
He was so angry about how he'd been treated. And the representative, instead of arguing with him, she just listened. She apologized sincerely. And then she said, if you were the president of this company, what would you do?
Wow. So she appealed to his sense of fairness.
Exactly. And it worked. The customer, he calmed down, he thought about it, and he actually ended up adjusting the bill himself to something that was totally fair.
That's incredible. It's deep down, we all want to be seen as good, fair people.
Right. And when you appeal to that side of someone, you'd be surprised what you can accomplish.
Absolutely. It's like that saying, you get more with a spoonful of sugar or something like that.
Exactly. And it's not about being manipulative. It's about understanding human nature and using that understanding to create win-win situations.
Right. And Carnegie, he doesn't just talk about this stuff in theory. He gives all these practical tips and examples.
Oh, yeah. He's big on the practical. He has this whole chapter on dramatizing your ideas.
Dramatizing. Okay, how do you do that?
Well, he uses the example of National Cash Register,
Yeah.
which back in the day, they were the big company.
Yeah.
And they used to have these sales conventions. But instead of just being boring lectures, they would have these elaborate skits and visual aids.
Oh, interesting. So they made it entertaining.
Exactly. Because they understood that people remember stories, they remember experiences way more than they remember just dry facts and figures.
Right. It's like that saying, show, don't tell.
Exactly. And Carnegie, he understood the power of storytelling, the power of making your message come alive.
And that's something that I think is so important, especially today when we're just bombarded with information from all sides.
All the time. So if you want to stand out, if you want to make an impact, you got to make it memorable.
Absolutely. Now, one thing I found really fascinating in the book was this idea of giving people a fine reputation to live up to.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's like that story he tells about the mechanic who wasn't performing very well. And instead of firing him, his boss basically gave him a reputation to live up to.
Right. He told him he had a reputation for being the best, fastest, most efficient mechanic around.
And the mechanic, he rose to the occasion. It's our beliefs about ourselves and others, they really can be self-fulfilling prophecies.
Totally. And I think that's something that we can all apply in our own lives, right? Like if we believe in someone, if we see the best in them, they're much more likely to live up to that expectation.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into how to win friends and influence people, I mean, we've just scratched the surface here, but what are some of your final thoughts on why this book has resonated with so many people for so long?
I think it's because at its core, it's about something that's timeless,
Mm.
right? It's about the power of human connection, the importance of understanding and empathy. These are things that will always be relevant, no matter how much the world changes.
Absolutely. And Carnegie, he didn't just give us a bunch of platitudes. He gave us practical tools and strategies that we can actually use to improve our relationships, our careers, our lives.
And that's why I think it's a book that everyone should read or reread, because there's always something new to discover in it.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive today, but we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What principle from How to Win Friends and Influence People resonated with you the most?
And how are you going to put it into practice in your own life?
Let us know in the comments below. Yeah. And until next time, keep on learning, keep on growing, and keep on connecting.